All right, good evening all, and welcome to Sinolit. I'm very glad here today to welcome a special guest with me, and he runs his own YouTube channel covering fascinating topics like are cities good for us? And many of you might know him from his work on the podcast of the Lotus Eaters for many years, where he covered politics, philosophy, and one time or two times, correct me if I'm wrong, Chinese proverbs with Stelios. And that was something that I appreciated. So I decided to invite him on. And thank you, Josh, for coming on with me to discuss Chinese proverbs.
Thanks for having me.
Good, excellent. So we've both selected our top 3 phrases or chengyu to analyze. Josh has chosen 3, and I've got 2, and I'm going to do one bonus phrase, time pending. We'll see how he goes with regards to time. So would you like to let us know how did you get into Chinese proverbs overall, or Chinese history at large, Josh?
So my interest started off with Chinese politics because, of course, China politically is very interesting. And then I got into the Three Kingdoms period of Chinese history.
Yes.
And that was both reading the sort of 14th century novel as well as watching the 2010 Chinese series, which is surprisingly good, although there's some very cheesy sort of 80s style kung fu combat in it.
That goes with the territory.
Mm-hmm. And also playing the Total War game afterwards, which helped me understand the characters probably better than anything in the Three Kingdoms period. But that got me on to looking at things like Taoism, and I listened to people like was it Joseph Campbell? Who else is there? I forgot his name now. English guy, always talks about Eastern philosophy. It's going to bug me now. I've got a few of his books.
James Legge, by any chance? He's the main translator.
He was a radio host in the 60s. He wrote The Way of the Tao, I think. I'm going to Google it because it's going to annoy me otherwise.
Not Stephen Mitchell.
No.
He's a translator, a recent translator. Any of those? Right, if anyone,
to my bookcase.
Well, maybe later we'll have time when I'm yakking on about one of my phrases. You might be able to have a quick look. If anyone in the audience knows, or of course, there's any questions at any point, do send us a comment or a question. We'll be asking questions, answering questions as we go along. So yeah, don't worry about that, Josh. We'll it might spring into my mind or your mind as we go along.
I hope so, because that's going to eat away at me slowly.
So yeah, some of what you're saying sounds familiar. For me, studying Chinese history, some of the viewers might know now, is a way for me to look at our own history and where we stand from outside our own box, as it were. And it makes things very clear. And I hope some of the phrases that we'll get into tonight will also cover parallels with our time. Absolutely.
I've remembered who it was. It was Alan Watts.
Oh, Alan Watts. Okay. Yes, that rings a bell. So, yes. Well, should we get into our first chengyu or phrase?
Of course.
Oh, I should briefly mention generally what chengyu are. Now, I think it was very well covered in your segment with Stelios, Josh. But I did notice a very good comment in the comment section on that, and I'd have to give credit to the commenter known as Unknown Vagrant. It was a very good comment. I'm going to read some of it. I just have to give credit to them because it was very succinct and described it very accurately. So with regards to the phrases we're going over, the Chinese language tries to compress, and I'm directly quoting here, as much meaning as possible into as few words as possible. These idioms that we're going to cover usually are 4 characters long, and they allow a person to draw a parallel to a past context and deliver meaning as succinctly as possible, which in the case of Chengyu is usually 4 words and therefore 4 syllables. And there's also a certain fixation throughout history with Chinese literati, the great philosophers and poets throughout time, to deliver 4-word sentences in the perfect situation and being able to throw them out to show their sign of being learned and that they know about their history. Because as you will see from our covering the actual phrases later, many of these Chengyu are directly from historical events that actually happened.
That's true, yes. They're sort of like a Chinese counterpart to the Japanese haiku, aren't they? In a sort of sense. Obviously, they're not identical, but the sentiment of trying to express a lot with a little is very similar.
Yes, absolutely. And so if you want to impress anyone here, not only with your Chinese skills, but also with your prerequisite knowledge of Chinese history, then our Chengyu today that we're going to cover are a shorthand for boundless wit and knowledge in China. So if you really want to impress, this is the way to do it.
So the one I've picked first, shall I read it in English first? Because I think I'll leave the Chinese to you, because you're going to be much better than me. But it is, thieves also have their Tao, in English at least, and it's got a lot more poetry to it, and it's original Chinese, which I'm going to try and butcher anyway, just to embarrass myself, which is Dao Yi Yo Dao. And the sort of succinctness and the fact that it's clever is that the word thieves and Tao sound very similar. And of course, Tao comes from Taoism, which is, something akin to both a philosophy and a religion. I would say it's more philosophical, but it's basically about how to live following the correct path. And so using that to contrast it against thieves is, of course, an interesting choice. And the fact they sound similar is also, it's clearly a cleverly composed series of words.
Yes, it has a rhythm to it. So if you see those 2 syllables, Dao and Dao, it's like a, what do you call it, parallelism. You've got the 2 same characters starting and ending this phrase. So also with the same pronunciation, Dao. You said it very well there, Josh.
Thank you.
Dao Yi Yo Dao. Yes.
Not quite as good as that, but I'll take.
Well, I'll let our Mandarin viewers be the judge of that, if we have any. So yeah, Dao Yi Yo Dao. So amongst thieves, they have their own morality, and I think one thing that I came across in research was actually quite a surprising connection. Here, let me show you, because the Chinese name for a film in some territories, not in all of China, but in, for example, Hong Kong, I think, and Singapore, the Chinese name for this film is Dao Yi Yo Dao, the phrase we just went over.
I didn't know that. That's great.
I didn't until you introduced the phrase to me. So the Chinese name of Goodfellas in some territories, I think Singapore and Hong Kong, is Dao Yi Yo Dao. And it's a long time since I watched the film, but I seem to remember that being a theme of the film, as in they still have their own code. Whether or not that's wrong or right is another question. But these criminals have their own code.
It's a way of doing things, I think, is the way I would put it. And part of the reason that one appealed to me, amongst a plethora of choices, is that it implies, to my mind and my naive ears, that there's a right way of doing things, even if they're wrong, if you know what I mean, morally wrong, but there's still a right way to go about it. And I think what it reminded me of more than anything, I'm not sure if you've seen the film Barry Lyndon, which few people have.
I'm intending to.
But it's one of Stanley Kubrick's I think, most beautifully shot films. But in that film, there's an Irish highwayman who stops the protagonist and is so polite about the theft that the main character goes away just like, I can't really be mad because he was such a gentleman about it that I kind of just parted with my stuff and moved on. And it's sort of that sentiment that there's always a sort of almost objectively correct way of going about things. And the reason it appealed to me is that it's asserting that there is a right or wrong way to do things. And I quite like that because I think that it encourages people to reflect on how they conduct themselves in things that might even be areas of expertise, because you're always having to assess it against an objective standard, I suppose.
And another way of looking at it is also even criminally producing, like for example in something like Breaking Bad, even they still have to produce the drugs in the same way. There's still a right way of doing things, even though they're doing the wrong thing.
Yes, well, this is the whole charm of the Cheng Yu, isn't it? That there's so much meaning that you can tease out of it, that there are all of these different interpretations. And in not to sound too much like a subjectivist, to counter my own previous point, but lots of them seem to be correct. And I like to think of their purpose as sort of substrate to encourage further thinking. And that's something that I also got out of Taoism more generally, is that there would be deliberately contradicting things in some of the Taoist texts that force you to actually reflect on it and come to your own conclusions rather than spoon feeding you the answers, which might be a bit of a spoiler for one of my next choices. But what was your general impression of this one?
Of this phrase, or Taoism?
This phrase.
Well, yes. I mean, I think the fact that it's known, that Goodfellas is known in Chinese as this very phrase is very apt, I think. And then also getting on more to the discussion we've briefly touched on about Taoism. It's interesting that also Confucius uses the word Tao a lot in his writings, and he came a bit later than the first articulator of Taoism, Lao Tzu, in the spring and autumn period, the fall of the Zhou dynasty back in sort of 800 BC. Confucius is around 400 BC. So he saw himself as following the Tao, but just in governance. He was a more applied thinker, whereas one gets the impression reading the Tao Te Ching, for example, the Tao Te Ching, that someone writing that would probably be a hermit, right? They'd probably live by themselves. They'd probably go off in the mountains somewhere and prefer not to be in government.
Yeah, well, this ties in quite nicely to another thing that we're going to bring up later, the Three Kingdoms period of Chinese history, which is, what is it, about 200 AD, around that sort of time period. And shortly before that, there was the Yellow Headband Rebellion, where I think a hermit monk in the mountains who was living out of a cave claimed to have found a text that came to him from the heavens. And it gave me the impression that this was just where a lot of the religious revelation of the time, if you will, or philosophical revelations, seemed to come from. Just people living in caves in isolation. And of course, in the Three Kingdoms, you have Master Sleeping Dragon, as they called him, who they had to coax out of being out in the wilderness, doing his studies and in isolation, to actually help with the Three Kingdoms conflict.
Yes, a lot of that rings bells. And there's also the story that one hermit living in the mountains for a long time, as soon as the emperor, I think it was Han Gaozu at the time, the first Han Dynasty emperor, as soon as the emperor, as the story goes, says to him, "You are my subject," apparently this Taoist hermit disappeared. into the ether. It's a little anecdote I read just recently. I found that very poignant because that Taoist ideal completely rejects any kind of, in general, by and large, any forceful acts in government, and more encourages, as you mentioned, a stepping away from, and sometimes those hermits would have to be forced into going into government, or like you said, finding some revelation.
There's lots of cases in Chinese history of people being forced via blackmail, just like, we will hurt your family if you don't help us run the government efficiently, which always struck me as a little bit odd from a Western perspective.
Yeah. I mean, that is how Lao Tzu, the story goes, the writer of the Tao Te Ching, he was in government before he wrote it, and as the story goes, he leaves government after being disillusioned. Sounds familiar to us now, right?
It certainly does.
He leaves government being disillusioned, and if you see him in pictures, it's usually on an oxen, because he rides off on an oxen into the wilderness, sort of by choice and by being forced out, as it were. And at
sorry. I was just going to say, my favorite way to characterize Taoism comes from Alan Watts, the name I couldn't remember earlier, where he puts it very succinctly that Taoism is like the art of sailing rather than rowing, in that you're using the environment around you to propel you forwards, and going with the flow, so to speak, rather than trying to force your way through something that is difficult.
Yes.
But sorry, do carry on.
That's what Lao Tzu did. Lao Tzu, I say the Chinese way all the time. So he's leaving the civilized world on an oxen, and then at the frontier, soldiers know of his wisdom and his sage reputation, and they ask him to write down his philosophy, and that is, as the story goes, how we get the Tao Te Ching, because of the disillusioned man in government.
All good things come from them. Well, sometimes.
Yes. I like this phrase, and also some of the others that we're going to cover tonight will have a very grounded historical context, like actual anecdote from where it comes from.
I think a lot of them, to be understood, you have to understand the culture in which they exist in, because if you read it in isolation, it doesn't necessarily make any sense to you. It's sort of expected that these are phrases for the Chinese people, if you will, not to sound too contemporary in my Chinese sort of, what's the word? My characterization of the Chinese people.
And I mean, of course, it also goes without saying, of course, one can study one's own history and one's own civilization and glean these lessons. It's just that I think it's something we've mentioned already before. Sometimes it just helps to compare and look at something else before looking within. And I think a lot of these phrases can be helpful for that. To see.
I also think that... Oh, sorry.
Go on, Josh.
I think there's also an aspect of Eastern philosophy that I prefer to Western philosophy. I see Taoism and Stoicism as comparable and contemporary of one another, even though they obviously had very little contact with one another. But I think that Taoism deals with human emotion in a far more healthy way, whereas Stoicism says it should be, ignored. Taoism says that it should be redirected. And I think that that's actually a much better and healthier way of looking at it.
Yeah, I've read Buddhist texts as well, as they came to China after the Han Dynasty, really. We're talking about sort of from the Han Dynasty onwards, from 0 BC, it starts coming down the Silk Road. I've always found Buddhism to be a little more detached. I mean, the ideal is to meditate oneself out of reality, right? I know they frame it in another way, and I know that they call it other words like nirvana, and but at the end of the day, what it is detaching oneself completely from any emotions and
any worldly
and
desires.
That's always sounded to me quite cold. Because I mean, what else are humans but people with feelings? I mean, it doesn't sound healthy to me.
To sort of steel man the Buddhist position here, I think they're saying it almost as an antidote to a predisposition. So they know that you're still going to be alive in the world and you're still going to have, you know, all of the concerns of a worldly person, but having a little bit more of this perspective is a good counterweight to that. That's how I've always understood it, because it's not possible to entirely detach yourself from the world, because you do have to eat and drink, and there are things of the world that you have to do, no matter how radical you are in your Buddhism.
Yeah, I still come away with the impression that not only is it more detached than Taoism. There's no verse, for example, in the Tao Te Ching which recommends ignoring emotions. It's more about noticing them and not getting carried away with them, which is something I haven't got the impression from with Buddhism. But also, Buddhism isn't a native Chinese philosophy. It came from India, right? And it came much later
Northern
on.
India, sort of close to the Himalayas, right?
That's right. So really, Buddhism is an overlay on what was already there. And as you mentioned before, with Taoism being more of a philosophy, I agree with you. And at the same time, Taoism took on a sort of folk element over time, where you get these practices of, you know, putting your yin and yang symbol on something and it having magical power. That's not something anywhere in the Tao Te Ching or anywhere in the Zhuangzi, the second text of Taoism, the Chuangzu. There's none of these sort of folk practices in a similar way to how over time Buddhism got overlaid onto what was already there and sort of piggybacked off it over time. And I mean, the three real Chinese philosophies are Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. But legalism's more of a method of governance than anything else. But yeah, Buddhism isn't really native to China.
No. I believe you have one for me, which I'm very excited to hear, because you've seen the Chengyu that I've picked, but I'm not sure what you've actually got for me here.
Right. Okay. I'll go with my first one then. Thanks for that first one, Josh.
That's all right.
JiaYuGuan, and that was a big surprise for me, because now I know Goodfella's Chinese name. I didn't know that before. Very apt. Right. So here's my first one. It should be up on the screen now. 知路为马, 知路为马. So literally, Lu is stag, and Ma is horse. So it's to call a stag a horse. But the historical context from which it comes really brings this phrase to life and gives it another element. I mean, I already, just on its face, I think many of us will be familiar nowadays to having to call a stag a horse, right?
I get that, yes.
Yeah. But even with the historical context, it even adds another layer to things. So how to start with this, right? So the actual historical context of this is, it comes from the end of the Qin dynasty, the unifiers, and we have in the court a eunuch called, and I think he should be up on the screen now, called Zhao Gao, and he is the chief advisor to Qing Shi. That's the second emperor of the Qin dynasty. This is in 210 BC. And he pulls the strings. He's become a very powerful court eunuch.
There's a running theme through Chinese history of eunuchs doing that sort of thing.
exactly. It's always associated with the fall of the dynasty. And later emperors, like the founder of the Ming dynasty, Ming Taizu, warns against involvement of eunuchs in court and tried to keep them out of it.
It's very sage advice considering
yes.
the country's history up to that
Yes,
point.
exactly. It just keeps happening. I don't know how it happens, but I don't know why this thing just keeps happening every time a civilization falls. We have eunuchs, or even many of us might now know they might not be eunuchs, but they're in eunuchs in anything but name, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, he's a very powerful eunuch who put into place Qin Shi, the idiot second son of Qin Shi Huang, the unifier, and by subversion as usual, the letter which he sent to his more capable son Fu Su to be the emperor. He changed the name and made it Qin Shi, who coincided with the collapse of the dynasty. So anyway, on a court day, he brings all the civil servants to court and wheels in a stag. He wheels in a stag to court, and he says, "If you think this is a stag, stand to my left. If you think this is a horse, stand to my right." So it's a sort of, a test of loyalty. And all the civil servants go along with this. They all say, "Yes, it's a horse," because he says it's a horse, but it's not. Obviously, everyone can see, but they don't believe what their lying eyes tell them. Even the emperor himself. This is Qin Shi, the idiot emperor I mentioned earlier. He cannot tell. He has to ask his chief advisor, what is this I'm seeing? Am I seeing a stag or am I seeing a horse? He's shown that he's completely under the spell of his chief advisor and can no longer believe what his eyes tell him. And that's how the story goes. And only 2 years later, the Qin dynasty falls in 208 BC, with the third emperor, Ziyin, not even being called emperor anymore, and their territories receding all the way back to the original territory on the west. That was the territory from which the Qing dynasty sprang from. And there we have it. Zhulu Weimar, to call a stag a horse.
There is a lot more depth to that than I expected, because it seems so very intuitive, doesn't it? And yet there's a massive wealth of historical meaning behind it.
Yeah. I mean, we're all now being asked to call a stag a horse, aren't we?
We are indeed.
And some of us we're not going along with this.
Well, I'm going to get chucked out of the court now, I think.
Yes, you would have done if you were there. Yes. So yeah, that's our second phrase for today, Zhulu Weimar. And if there's anything else I haven't covered properly here, or shall we move on to your next phrase, Josh?
Well, I think the phrase is very easy to understand, isn't it? It's to suggest that you're deliberately misrepresenting something, and it's the use as an idiom itself is obvious. My mental image is of a Chinese market. There's a trader trying to sell someone something and claiming that it's the best thing ever, and they're saying, trying to call a stag a horse here. It's just one of those phrases where its utility is so obvious that it would obviously be used very frequently.
And there you go. You could throw it out if you want to point out that you're being cheated or you're being asked to lie. Zhulu Weimar. That's your phrase for that situation. Yeah.
I'm going to use that one in court.
Yeah. So
I'll move on to my second one. Yes. Just open up the book of Proverbs. Feels like reading a magic book here. Where was I? Aha. So the literal meaning in English is whole swallowed dates.
I'll just get this up.
And I can read a little bit of the context of this, if you like, from the book, because it does have a good explanation. And it says, a doctor told his patient that eating dates would be a good cure for his spleen problem, but that he needed to be careful of eating too many, as chewing them could damage his teeth. The patient replied that there was no problem. He would simply swallow them whole without chewing. What he did not realize was that this would cause him stomach problems and make his spleen worse. Learning by rote has been the basis of Chinese education for many centuries, although, of course, that is now changing. This is the book saying this, by the way. So swallowing dates whole was a constant danger. But it seems to be a phrase that is going against rote learning. And I think that that's something that, as the book suggests, is still a problem to a certain extent, because I've spoke to lots of people who've worked in both the East and West, and they said, particularly in education, and they've said that one thing that they try and encourage more is creative solutions and not just memorizing information and being able to recite it. And I think that there's almost a cautionary tale wrapped up in why I picked it, in that obviously this phrase has come from China, and yet the lesson within it is still something that they could benefit from embracing more, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I lived there for quite a while, and I'd know students who would actually be up until 11 in the evening, doing what we might describe as rote learning. At the same time, I feel we've gone too far the other way here. There is a time and a place for rote learning, and maybe not necessarily, as it says here, not digesting it, but just knowing things like times tables. There's not really any way around just rote learning. And for example, things like formulas, that kind of thing. There's no way around learning that without some form of rote learning. I think we've gone too far the other way here to sort of, teachers nowadays, they go, let the students explore themselves and find out and lead themselves. This can be almost too far the other way.
I think there's a problem in terms of rote learning with people not understanding the spirit of why they're learning in the first place, in that they're rote learning information to do well in their tests and to get good results, not necessarily keeping in the bigger picture of you need to have a baseline understanding of the world to be able to live a good life. And I think that the latter is the most important perspective, because that means that you learn for the sake of learning, and therefore you will enjoy it more, and it isn't so purposive. But as you say, you do need a certain baseline of understanding to be able to then go on and have a more in-depth discussion about these sorts of things. So, if, for example, I were to just randomly, what's popped into my head is, if I were to have a good understanding of the Russian Revolution, I do still need to have a good understanding of the dates and what happened and how it happened sequentially before I can then talk about the morality or the policy failures or things like that. So that some degree of rote learning is necessary. He has to eat the dates. It's good for him, but it's how you swallow it that is the problem and the end goal. He was simply fulfilling the doctor's orders in sort of easiest way he possibly could, rather than understanding the whole purpose of it and how it all ties together. I'll admit to probably doing a bit of this 混沌吞枣 back in school. I mean, we were all. It is heavily incentivized, isn't it?
Yeah, right. I mean, with a particular, shall we say, ideological and political slant. That kind of stuff is rammed down people's throats, right?
Of course, yeah.
Whereas the stuff that should be done rote learning, things like maths and formulas and things like that, it's very fashionable to reject rote learning here. That was my experience back when I was in school.
I think
and from
it
what I hear
depends on
about
what
teachers,
it depends on what you're studying, doesn't it? I think
Mm.
with things like mathematics, you've got to rote learn the rules and how to go about it, because it's a rule-based discipline, and there is a very clear and correct way of doing things. And if you have to figure it out for yourself, it does massively increase the chance of making a mistake. But with things that aren't as objective and black and white, I think a certain degree of reflectiveness and understanding the greater meaning, disciplines like history or literature, I think are much better approached without this rote learning perspective, even though some baseline understanding is necessary, which you've got to learn this way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, indeed. And just a side note to this, the Zhao that is mentioned here, dates, if anyone's in China or traveling there or visiting, best dates are Hongzhao, very good. I think the translation of that is jujube, apparently very good for your blood pressure. I didn't get a chance to test it out, but apparently they're very good for that.
I'll need to avoid them, and mine's very low, so I might pass out if I eat them.
I mean, very good for blood pressure, either if it's too low or too high.
Oh, okay. In which case,
yeah, apparently it's good at balancing out.
You never thought you'd get dietary advice in this podcast, did you?
No, I didn't either. I didn't earlier. I didn't think that would come up, but yeah, Hongzhao, very very good type of dates over there. Very big. I remember them being almost the size of my palm. Very very large dates over there.
Date palm. I always associated them with the Middle East. Things like that.
Yeah,
I didn't even realize they got all the way to China.
Or Xinjiang, Central Asia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They got the climate, haven't they?
Yeah. That's one place I never went to when I was there. I went to Gansu. That's quite far west. That's quite a long way up the Silk Road. So, for example, I went to JiaYuGuan. That's the western end of the Great Wall.
Okay.
I went there back in, crikey, what was it now? 2013 now. Makes me feel so old. Yeah. And that's if you search it, JiaYuGuan is quite an iconic looking fort out in the desert. I'll type it up in the chat there. Yeah, I'll try and type it out later in the comments section when we finish the stream. But yeah, very beautiful fort there in the desert, and I went there a long time ago. Not quite the dates area. That's Xinjiang, a bit further west from where I went. But yeah, that is quite a far way west.
I think we've gone over everything about this one, haven't we?
All right. Okay. So let me introduce my next one. So next one is you should be able to see now Muho or Guam, or literally a monkey wearing a hat. And this again is like the one I talked about before, Julu Wei Ma. It's obvious on its front what it means, but there's even a greater layer of depth when one knows the history of it. Do you know any monkeys wearing hats, Josh?
It's not some sort of reference to Journey to the West, is it?
Not this one, no.
Okay.
But I can understand why you would think that.
I've not actually read it yet, so I'm only speculating.
Another very long read. Like, I mean, you mentioned Three Kingdoms earlier. I admit to not being able to get through that myself, although I did watch the film.
I've read it in 2 days. It's
crikey.
a long 2 days.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But I couldn't put it down.
I've got it behind me. I've got the first volume there. Never way. Okay, I've got that one.
Oh yeah.
I only got through 30 pages and just found it. Yeah. Like
I also have I think I lent out my original copy and I never got it back. But I've also got a history version, because the records of the three kingdoms, because of course it's the equivalent to Shakespeare telling the story of Julius Caesar, in that there's lots of speculation about people saying things that there's no possible way they could have known this 1,200 years later.
Yeah, it's written during the Ming Dynasty. I think
That's the 14th century, I think so.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, it was quite a long time later, wasn't it? Yeah. But no, this one isn't a reference to that. It's just a reference to someone they might be wearing imposing attire. They might look impressive. They might
hat's
look
imposing?
well, it's more like a crown, really. This is
okay.
One more like a crown, and the context for this will make it clear. So I'll introduce that now. So a monkey wearing hat, someone quite literally, Hozi is monkey in Chinese, and then Guan means wearing a crown. So this comes from the context of this gentleman here is Han Sheng. Now, at the fall of the Qin dynasty that I just mentioned, with to call a stag, to call a horse a stag, the Qin dynasty has fallen, and many kingdoms, former kingdoms that were unified under the Qin dynasty, are rebelling, and they're imposing their identities, and they're saying, we no longer want to be unified. We want to have our own kingdoms back. One of the former nobles, Shang Yu of the Chu kingdom, rebels and takes down the Qin dynasty, although they were falling at the Battle of Judu in around 208 BC. And he takes the whole lot. He takes the capital, Shenyang. But what he does, and what many people probably didn't expect him to do, was he just divides the kingdom up, or the empire up again, into 18 kingdoms, and allots himself the former Western Chu. He said he wants to just be a man of Western Chu again. He doesn't wish for the rest of the empire. He just wants his former kingdom back. He just wants to go back to the way things were before the Qin unified them. And this gentleman, Han Sheng, comes to court and says, he's a civil servant. He says, Shang Yu, what are you doing? You've taken the seat of power and you've retreated. You've taken the place from which the fertile land, as he's saying there. This is the base from which the unifiers sprung out in the West. It's a good defensive territory. It's hard to get to. It's hard to attack. You've got the seat of power. You're giving it up. Why? Someone else is going to do it. If you don't, someone else will. And Shang Yu just, no, I just want to be the king of Western Chu. He says, and we don't know exactly why he did, but we can make some good guesses. And the guess is that he just wants his old kingdom back. He doesn't long for the whole empire to be unified anymore. He doesn't have a large vision for the empire like the person who defeated him does. Liu Bang, the founder of the Han dynasty, was the man who took that seat and takes the whole empire once more and unifies them. And that's how we get the Han dynasty, because this man, Shang Yu, took them down, took the Qin dynasty down, but he didn't want the chess set. He just wanted his little piece, right? He just wants his country back. He wants his old England back, as it were.
It's admirable in a way, isn't it? In the not pursuing power for its own sake. I can understand why someone would want to do such a thing. I'm also struck by the fact that the person you've got on screen is the actor that plays Lu Bu in the Three Kingdoms thing, and that's all I can see him as now. But yes, is the actual phrase itself, is it admonishing him for this,
Yes,
or is it?
yeah, I was going to get to that. That's right, Josh. Yeah. So the screenshot is rather unfortunate. And I wasn't sure. I would have played the scene. It comes, by the way, it comes from King's War, or The Legend of Chu and Han, made back in 2012, a TV series. I've covered it on my channel quite a lot. Highly recommended, because there are many parallels to our own time, as I'm sure clued up viewers will be noticing. Because he rejects the seed of power, this advisor Han Sheng says, you people, he just gives up. He's like, well, if you're not going to take the seed of power, someone else is. So he calls him, and rather brashly, I think, he calls him, the people of Chu are monkeys in human hats, or monkeys wearing crowns, to admonish him for his stupidity. And of course, he although Xiang Yu doesn't have a grand vision of China and a unified empire, he does hold enough power, obviously, in that moment to execute this man. And that's how the story goes. And that is how we get the phrase Wu Ho Guan. Because if one wants to take power, you've got to take the whole thing. You've got to have a grand vision. Otherwise, for example, in this context, Liu Bang beats him because he wants the whole chess set, and Xiang Yu doesn't. He just wants his old country back. So he's like, as the civil servant says, an imposing man, but worthless.
A sort of modern counterpart to this might be in Breaking Bad, where they say no half measures.
Mm-hmm.
In that, if you go halfway, it's worse than not doing anything at all.
Yeah,
I think there's a comparable sentiment expressed here, isn't there?
Yeah, and that's what gets Xiang Yu killed. It's not because he's the greatest warrior of this story. He's the bravest. He's the man who takes down the Qin Empire, outnumbered at the Battle of Julu, 200,000 Qin soldiers against his 70,000, takes them down. But because he retreats back, and he just wants his little piece. He doesn't realize Liu Bang, the founder of the Han Dynasty, was fighting for his life. He was forced into rebellion because he was escorting a chain gang of prisoners to the capital Shenyang to fulfill their manual labor duty. And he couldn't get them there on time. And under Qin law, he would have been punished for that. So he didn't realize that Liu Bang, his enemy, his erstwhile ally, he was an ally for a time, was fighting for his life. Whereas Xiang Yu was just fighting for his little piece. He just wanted things to go back, and he hated the Qin dynasty because he was a noble of the former Chu kingdom. There's this resentment, which is justifiable for being conquered. But because he doesn't want the whole lot, like you said there, no half measures, but he can't go the whole way. He doesn't have that vision, and Liu Bang does, and that's why he won the Chu-Han contention. That's between the Qin dynasty and the long-lived Han dynasty.
I'm pretty sure that Niccolo Machiavelli's favourite Xiang Yu would definitely be this one then.
It might well be, if he knew the history for it. Yeah. Because it doesn't seem on the face of it so, I suppose, so political, does it?
No, not at all.
Yeah, it just seems like you could call someone, who wears grand clothes and puts on a show, but is an idiot. You could call them that. But once one knows the history of this, it's even more compelling. I find anyway.
I would say so. Shall I read my final one?
Yes. Okay.
So this one is definitely one that needs some degree of explanation. So you're not going to understand it if you don't, just at face value. But it is Kong Rong allows a pair in English. And I'm not going to try and read the Chinese because I'd find it particularly difficult. but I'm going to read what it says in my book here because it explains the historical context very well. It says, the saying comes from a folk tale about a young boy called Kong Rong. He had 5 elder brothers and 1 younger. One day the family was given a gift of a bowl of pears. When told that he could have first choice, he chose the smaller one. His father asked him why he didn't take a larger one, and he replied that he should leave those for his elder brothers. And as they were senior to him, and he says, his father says, but you have a younger brother. And he says in response, oh no, he doesn't. This is still his father. Don't you deserve a bigger one than him? And he says, no, I am his elder brother and I should look after him. And I thought that was a very nice sentiment. And I think it's also getting at something, isn't it? In that there is a sort of natural order of things in that no matter how well-intentioned a family is, sometimes the older brothers tend to get preferential treatment because they make it so. However, you can act in a way in which you don't have to default to this norm. You can actually be benevolent. And why I was drawn to it and why I liked it is that it's sort of the essence of what makes politeness, isn't it? And it's particularly interesting because it's internal in his own family. And I sort of took it to mean, once I had the context, that showing kindness to one's family is a good thing, and being somewhat selfless and viewing the family unit as a whole. And when you look at how in China they tend to be a bit more collectivist, even pre-communist, just as a cultural practice, as much of East Asia is. And this sort of gets my psychologist brain going, because the sort of psychology of this arrangement is that they view being dependent on one's family not like a Westerner as a weakness, but as a form of strength, in that through being dependent on one another, you create something that's greater than the individual. And if you use that analogy for an explanation for why politeness is important more generally, then it's actually very powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I might be putting my own perspective on it a fair amount, but I think part of the charm is that you tease your own lessons out of it.
Yeah, that sounds accurate. And I one thing I've always thought when I step outside my own box of the history I know of my own country and my own civilization is that sometimes I do think we could stand to be more almost too individualistic in some ways. And I think sometimes, I mean, that's playing itself out now. We could stand to be more thinking of ourselves as a unit rather than thinking of ourselves as individuals so much.
Yeah, I think I'm still quite prone to being an individualist, but I think that it has to be augmented with a consideration for the people around you. You can't be so individualistic that you are uncaring or indifferent to others. And I think that there's a balance to be struck, because of course you can also go too far. And this is what I always use to explain how sometimes being altruistic is in its own form sometimes bad, in that someone can be so altruistic that they give away all their possessions and they suffer far more than the people that they have benefited in terms of equivalence. And so there's always somewhere within the bounds of the extremities where you need to find some sort of compromise. Otherwise you're either going to be incredibly selfish or so unselfish that you harm yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I've always found the basics of Aristotle to be quite appealing in this regard, finding a balance and the wisdom to know when one is taking care of oneself enough to be able to take care of others is a hard balance to find. it looks like here this person, Kongrong, was thinking of his younger brothers first, and that plays into the Confucian concept. And I'm not sure whether Kongrong himself would have considered himself a Confucian, but it certainly would have influenced
he would be
his
contemporary with the Three Kingdoms period. So was Confucius was pre that, wasn't he?
Is warring spring and autumn period, late spring and autumn, the fall of the Zhou into,
of course,
the
they reference Confucius. What am I talking about? It's been a while. But he's quite a famous figure in his own right, isn't he?
He's a poet, and I think he was with there were of the Three Kingdoms period. There were, obviously, as the name suggests, Three Kingdoms. I think he was associated with the one of Liu Bei, that is Shu, the southwestern kingdom.
Yes, and in the actual novel itself, for those who haven't read it, Liu Bei is sort of set up to be the sympathetic character, even though there's a scene in the book where he throws aside his infant son, that one of his generals went to great lengths to rescue, and he says, "Hey, I don't need this son. You're far more important to me," which I feel like is a little bit questionable.
No.
They also they try and make out Cao Cao as being this great villain, but he plays the art of politics very well and is also a massive sponsor of the art. So it's not quite as cut and dry. But I'm getting carried away here talking about the history.
I can understand you. It's a real rabbit hole to get into, isn't it? Yeah, go for it. I mean, it's funny. You made a connection in my head that I didn't know existed. Right. So you mentioned that story about Liu Bei throwing his son out of the carriage to escape. Am I right?
Well, what happened is they were ambushed and they all got split up, and he managed to escape, but his son was left behind in the care. I forgot his name now, but he was one of the best generals under Liu Bei's command. He could have gone his own way and succeeded if he wanted to, but he was so virtuous that he just wanted to serve someone who he saw as benevolent. And he basically fought off many men whilst one-armed, holding the baby, trying to escape. And then when he actually arrives and presents it, thinking, okay, thankfully I've saved his son, he's like, no, I'm going to throw that away. You're more important to me. No. It's meant to be this very sentimental thing between the two men, that he's very grateful for his service and his selflessness. But it seems a little bit harsh on the child.
Well, it's really funny. I didn't know that because I haven't read the Three Kingdoms novel, but Liu Bei's forebear, his namesake, the founder of the Han Dynasty, Liu Bang, who Liu Bei claims to share the same surname, right, Liu? I know a lot of people probably over the course of 400 years probably took that name for themselves, which did happen in Chinese history, by the way. That's one of the main reasons why nowadays you've got 6 or 7 main family names: Huang, like Yang, Liu, because the dynasties, ruling families, were so well known and so famous that people often just took those family names for themselves.
There's a sort of more close to home example of people in Scotland taking the name of their clan leader, which I found out tracing my family history.
Right, yeah.
So it's that same thing.
I didn't know you Burmese. That's never sounded. I've always thought that was French.
Well, it's because you're pronouncing the E at the end. Right. If you say it with a Scottish accent, it all of a sudden becomes a lot clearer. It's Ferm, which comes from Fairholme, which is a much more familiar name that we could identify as being of the British Isles, right? But yes, I always get that. or also people say Josh Fern, as in the plant. It's a nightmare. I've always got to spell out my surname.
Oh no, I suppose you don't have it as easy as Liu Bei, right? He could just, there are probably millions of people at that point with that family name.
That's true.
As if you go onto the census, or even in Wikipedia, I think you can see the top 10 Chinese family names have like at least 10 million people for each one. Anyway, I was just about to make that connection. So Liu Bei's forebear, Liu Bang, who he claims descendants from, also has a similar anecdote about him. He's escaping the Battle of Pengcheng in the Chuhan contention, and as the records of the grand historian goes, the writer Sima Qian records that he threw his child out of the carriage to escape in his own escape story. So it's funny how both Lius did the same thing. But
of course, it's worth mentioning as well that Sima Qian was an adversary of Liu Bei, wasn't he? He eventually went on to become the emperor, didn't he? And so it would make sense to make out that one of the people Liu Bei was descended from froze his children out of carriages and the like.
It is quite confusing. I'm pretty sure they are different ones. Sima Qian, yeah, it's very confusing because there's a lot of unfortunately in Chinese history there's a lot of people with the same family name. Sima is a very famous name. The one I'm referring to wrote the records of the grand historian, the Shiji, back in 145 BC. But there are a lot of Simas, so it is quite confusing.
There's a double layer of confusion there as well, because the emperors of that sort of time were also known for actually publishing their own literature and Cao, his poetry and things like that. So it's not unheard of. It would be a bit unusual to us today in the West to think of an emperor spending his time writing and practicing the arts in that way, but it seems to be quite common. I think it's quite healthy, actually.
Yeah, a lot of them were poets. Even, ironically enough, Mao considered himself a poet. There's a long history of that, particularly with poetry. The novel was a very, very modern thing, really, in comparison in China. Only sort of literary people only really started engaging in writing stories as a high class, highbrow art, from the Ming Dynasty, the 1400s onwards. It was always poetry, and it still is in a way. Poetry is still the main form of way of showing one's own knowledge and wisdom.
That's interesting to know. I didn't know that.
Yeah, still to this day. I mean, like these Chengyu that we're going over, is still now a sign of a well-educated person to just throw out, to call a stag a horse, or muho guan.
Well, I'm feeling very good about myself then. Having gone through a few.
Yeah, that's a very good one. I think have we covered that one fully, Josh?
I would say so.
All right, grand. So I think we've covered nearly all of them now, haven't we? Is there only one more? Or am I okay? All right, last one, a bonus one, since we've got the time. If that's all right with you, Josh.
Of course, yeah.
Last one, okay. So the last one is okay. Kwa Sha Zhiru. And I hope that this one will bring some hope to many of us in an audience, because this one is literally the humiliation of being forced to crawl between someone's legs. As the story goes, the great general Han Xin, who was the general of Liu Bang, the founder of the Han Dynasty, in his youth he was a vagabond he was a former noble of one of the kingdoms, and he had a right to walk around with his own sword. And one day, as the story goes, he catches the attention of a attractive lady in the market, and she likes him. But the local henchman in the market doesn't like this. He likes the girl as well, and he tries to wind Hanshin up into using his sword. But Hanshin's a pacifist at this time. We all go through this stage, I think. Well, many of us do anyway. A stage of all violence is bad. I don't want to hurt anyone. And he's in that stage of his life, and this guy winds him up, pushes him around, and says, "Oh, you've got this sword. Well, why don't you use it then?" He's trying to egg him on, get him into a fight. And Hanshin refuses to do anything. So he says, "Well, go on then, crawl through my legs." And he does it in front of everyone, the marketplace, in front of this girl. And he does. He just crawls because he refuses to use any violence. And of course, this man, after this humiliation in his probably 20s, goes on to be the general of Liu, the founder of the Han Dynasty. So hope to us all who've experienced a tough period in our early life and in our 20s and even into our 30s. For example, Liu, the founder of the Han Dynasty himself, he was in his 40s. He was a nothing. He was a son of a peasant until he rose his flag of rebellion in his 40s and then subsequently became the emperor. So there's hope for us all, as history shows.
Yes, we could all become an emperor.
Yeah,
we just don't know it yet.
or a general in the case of Hanshin.
That's true. Yes. That is a good one. Mm-hmm. It's a nice positive note to end on, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So if you do have any questions or comments, anyone, do let us know, and we'll cover them. Or attempt to answer them in the last few minutes. So I hope that's been a educational experience for everyone, and someone's taken away something from this.
I certainly have.
Thank you, Josh, for joining me.
That's okay. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it doesn't look like we've got any questions. So yeah, have a good evening, Josh, and have a good evening, everyone.
Goodbye.